Imagine a cold so profound that it alters the molecular structure of steel. Imagine a wind howling out of Siberia at 50 miles per hour, dropping the wind chill to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing the lubricating oil inside an M1 Garand rifle until the action cycles like it is filled with wet cement. Imagine being surrounded by towering, jagged peaks in the dead of night, knowing that tens of thousands of unseen enemies are moving through the snow, completely undetected by the most advanced military intelligence apparatus on the planet. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This was the reality in late November of 1950 in a desolate, frozen corner of North Korea known as the Chosin Reservoir. How does a modern mechanized army survive when the very air they breathe is actively trying to kill them? We are going to break down one of the most brutal, unforgiving, and tactically complex winter campaigns in modern military history. Before we dissect the firepower, the catastrophic intelligence failures, and the sheer human endurance that defined this frozen hell, take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling us which historical winter battle you think was the most punishing. Your engagement keeps our logistical supply lines running, allowing us to bring you these deep dive tactical analyses. Now, let us strip away the mythology and look at the hard tactical realities of the Chosin Reservoir. To understand how 30,000 American and United Nations troops ended up fighting for their lives against 120,000 Chinese soldiers in a frozen wasteland, we have to pull back and look at the strategic map. The roots of this conflict go far deeper than the crossing of the 38th parallel in June of 1950. You have to look at the geopolitical real estate of the Korean peninsula itself. For centuries, Korea has been the bloody bridge between continental Asia and the Japanese archipelago. If you look back at the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, the entire conflict ignited over who would control the warm water ports of Korea and the railway access into Manchuria. Fast forward to 1945, and the division of Korea by the victorious Allied powers was nothing more than a hastily drawn line on a map, a temporary bandage over a massive geopolitical fault line. When Kim Il-sung's North Korean People's Army smashed across that border in June 1950, backed by Soviet armor and Chinese logistical support, they nearly pushed the Americans right off the peninsula into the sea at the Pusan perimeter. But then came September, and General Douglas MacArthur executed the Incheon landing. It was a masterpiece of amphibious warfare, a sweeping left hook that severed the North Korean supply lines and shattered their army. MacArthur's forces broke out of Pusan, recaptured Seoul, and began a massive mechanized drive north, crossing the 38th parallel. The objective was total victory, the complete reunification of Korea under a pro-Western government. The United Nations forces were racing toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and the newly established People's Republic of China. But success breeds a very specific type of military arrogance. Did MacArthur really believe the Chinese would just sit across the river and watch their buffer state evaporate? The intelligence failure at the highest levels of the United Nations command is a textbook example of confirmation bias. MacArthur's chief of intelligence, Major General Charles A. Willoughby, was looking at aerial reconnaissance photos and completely ignoring the human intelligence reports coming from the ground. Willoughby and MacArthur believed that China, a nation still bleeding from decades of civil war and Japanese occupation, lacked the industrial capacity and the mechanized logistics to intervene against a nuclear-armed superpower. They calculated that any Chinese intervention would be a token force, easily destroyed by American air supremacy. This was a catastrophic misreading of Mao Zedong's strategic mindset. Mao did not view the war through the lens of mechanized logistics. He viewed it through the lens of political survival and manpower. To Mao, an American army sitting on the Yalu River was an existential threat to the industrial heartland of Manchuria. Mao ordered the People's Volunteer Army, the PVA, to secretly cross the Yalu. They did not come with massive armored columns or motorized supply convoys. They came on foot, moving exclusively at night, under strict camouflage discipline. If a U.S. reconnaissance plane flew over, any Chinese soldier who moved a muscle was summarily executed by his own officers. They marched 18 miles a night through the rugged, freezing mountains, completely invisible to American air power. This brings us to the operational theater itself, the Chosin Reservoir. The Americans called it Chosin based on outdated Japanese maps, but to the Koreans it is the Changjin Reservoir. It is not a natural lake. It is a massive, man-made hydroelectric dam situated in the Taebaek Mountains at an elevation of roughly 4,000 feet. The terrain is a nightmare of steep ridges, deep gorges, and narrow, winding dirt tracks. There was only one road that mattered. It was a single-lane, unpaved mining road that ran 78 miles from the coastal port of Hungnam, up through the mountains, through the villages of Koto-ri and Hagagar-ri, and eventually splitting at the reservoir toward Udam-ni. This single dirt path was the main supply route, the MSR. For a mechanized army, a single road is a tether. It is a lifeline, but it is also a fatal vulnerability. You can have all the firepower in the world, but if your enemy cuts that road, your tanks run out of gas, your artillery runs out of shells, and your men starve. How do you defend a 78-mile dirt road when you are strung out in isolated perimeters and outnumbered 10-1? Let us look at the combatants, starting with the United States the Terre Corps, commanded by Major General Edward Almond. Almond was an aggressive, ambitious officer, a MacArthur loyalist who believed in rapid advance at all costs. He pushed his units relentlessly into the mountains, spreading them dangerously thin. But the spearhead of Tint's Corps was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith. Smith was the antithesis of Almond. He was a quiet, methodical, highly intellectual Marine who immediately recognized the tactical insanity of the situation. Smith looked at the map, looked at the single dirt road, and realized his division was walking into a giant trap. While Almond demanded speed, Smith deliberately dragged his feet. He consolidated his forces. He stockpiled ammunition at every stop. Most importantly, when the Marines reached the village of Hagaru-ri at the southern tip of the reservoir, Smith ordered his engineers to build a C-47 transport airstrip right in the middle of the frozen valley. Almond thought it was a waste of time, but that single engineering decision by O.P. Smith would eventually save the entire division from total annihilation. The American forces were heavily armed, built around a doctrine of overwhelming firepower. At the squad level, the primary weapon was the M1 Garand, a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle chambered in .30-06. It was a battle-proven weapon from World War II, but the extreme cold of the Taebaek Mountains exposed its vulnerabilities. Standard military lubricant, LSA, thickened into a sticky paste at sub-zero temperatures. The operating rods of the Garands would freeze in the open position. Marines had to quickly learn to strip their weapons completely dry of oil, using graphite or firing them bone dry, to keep them cycling. The water-cooled Browning 17 Heavies machine guns had to be filled with anti-freeze, and when that ran out, the gunners used human urine to keep the water jackets from bursting. The artillery support was massive, consisting of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, capable of delivering devastating time-on-target barrages. But artillery requires solid ground to absorb the recoil. The ground at Chosin was frozen so solid that mortar base plates would literally shatter when fired, and artillery spades would bite into the earth, causing the big guns to slide backwards with every shot. For armored support, the Marines had the M26 Pershing and the M4A3E8 Sherman tanks. The Pershing, with its 90mm gun, was a beast, but it was underpowered and struggled on the icy, narrow mountain passes. The Sherman, while older, was actually more reliable on the steep grades. But tanks are useless if they cannot maneuver, and the terrain at Chosin confined them strictly to the single dirt road, turning them into highly visible pillboxes. The greatest advantage the Americans possessed was overhead. The 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, flying out of Yampo Airfield and off carriers in the Sea of Japan, provided relentless close air support. The primary attack aircraft was the F-4U Corsair, the iconic bent-wing fighter bomber. These aircraft could loiter over the battlefield, dropping 500-pound bombs, firing 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, and delivering napalm. Napalm was particularly devastating in the winter environment. Not only did it incinerate enemy troop concentrations, but the intense heat would temporarily thaw the frozen ground, and the psychological impact on an enemy completely lacking anti-aircraft artillery was immeasurable. What good is total air supremacy, however, when your enemy is completely invisible from the sky and only attacks in the dead of night. On the other side of the frozen valley was the Chinese Ninth Army Group, commanded by General Song Shilun. Song was a hardened veteran of the Chinese Civil War and the Long March. He understood guerrilla warfare, infiltration, and the brutal arithmetic of trading space and manpower for tactical advantage. The Ninth Army Group consisted of the 20th, 26th, and 27th Corps, totaling roughly 120,000 men. Their doctrine was vastly different from the Americans. The People's Volunteer Army relied on light infantry mobility, utilizing a tactic they called the short attack. They would infiltrate through the gaps in the enemy lines, often bypassing strongpoints, to attack command posts, artillery parks, and supply convoys in the rear. They moved almost exclusively at night, using bugles, whistles, and cymbals to coordinate their assaults in the darkness, a psychological warfare tactic designed to disorient and terrify the defending troops. But the Chinese military machine had a fatal flaw. Their logistics were practically non-existent. The Ninth Army Group had been rushed from the subtropical climate of southern China straight into the Manchurian winter. They were completely unequipped for the environment. Most of the Chinese soldiers were wearing thin cotton tunics and canvas rubber-soled shoes. They had no winter parkas, no sleeping bags, and no mechanized transport. Every bullet, every mortar shell, and every ration had to be carried on the backs of human pack mules or on Mongolian ponies. Their food consisted of frozen rice and dried peas, which they would try to thaw by holding it in their armpits. Before the battle even began, the Chinese were taking devastating casualties from the weather alone. Entire platoons would freeze to death in their ambush positions, their bodies found the next day still clutching their rifles. The American troops were struggling with the cold, suffering from trench foot due to the flawed design of their rubber-bottomed shoe packs, which caused feet to sweat and then freeze. But compared to the Chinese, the Americans were living in luxury. The weaponry of the People's Volunteer Army was a chaotic mix of captured small arms. They carried American Thompson submachine guns captured from nationalist Chinese forces, Japanese Arisaka rifles left over from World War II, and Soviet-supplied PPS-41 submachine guns, known as burp guns, for their incredibly high rate of fire. They lacked heavy artillery because they could not drag the big guns through the snow-choked mountain passes. Instead, they relied heavily on 60mm and 82mm mortars and massive quantities of stick grenades. Their strategy was simple but incredibly dangerous. They would absorb the punishing American air and artillery strikes during the day by hiding in deep caves and reverse-slope trenches. Then, as soon as the sun went down and the American aircraft were forced to return to base, the Chinese would emerge from the snow like ghosts, closing the distance rapidly to negate the American firepower advantage, turning the battle into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest of bayonets, grenades, and entrenching tools. We can compare this tactical situation to the Battle of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. At Bastogne, the American airborne forces were surrounded in freezing weather, holding a vital road junction against a massive German armored thrust. But at Bastogne, the Americans were defending a single condensed perimeter, and they were fighting a conventional army with recognizable supply lines. At the Chosin Reservoir, the American forces were not in one neat perimeter. They were strung out in a fragile 78-mile column, isolated in small pockets at Udamni, Hagaru-ri, and Kodo-ri. They were not fighting an enemy that relied on roads. They were fighting a fluid, formless mass of light infantry that could move through the most impassable terrain on Earth, completely enveloping the American positions. It was a logistical nightmare compounded by an environmental catastrophe. By late November, the temperature plummeted even further. A massive cold front swept down from Siberia, burying the Taebaek Mountains in deep snow. General Almond, still operating under the delusion that the Chinese forces were nothing more than a few scattered guerrilla bands, ordered General Smith to launch an offensive to the west, to link up with the 8th Army. The 1st Marine Division pushed out from the reservoir, their supply lines stretched to the absolute breaking point. The men were exhausted, their vehicles were freezing, and the ominous silence in the surrounding mountains was deafening. General Song Shilun had his Ninth Army Group exactly where he wanted them. 120,000 Chinese soldiers had silently slipped into position on the high ground surrounding the reservoir, cutting the road behind the Marines in multiple places. The trap had been meticulously set, the jaws were open, and as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of November 27th, the haunting sound of bugles began to echo through the frozen valleys. The piercing shrieks of whistles and the crash of cymbals shattered the dead silence of the night, acting as the primitive but highly effective command and control network for the Chinese Ninth Army Group. When you are operating in -30-degree temperatures, radio batteries die in minutes. But a brass bugle never runs out of power. The assault on the night of November 27th hit the 1st Marine Division at Udamni like a tidal wave of quilted cotton and steel. The Chinese tactical doctrine, formulated by Mao Zedong and perfected during their civil war, was known as 1.2 sides. It was a strategy of envelopment. They would hit the front of an American perimeter with a pinning attack, a noisy, aggressive frontal assault designed to draw all the defending firepower and attention forward. Simultaneously, 2 flanking columns would silently infiltrate through the jagged ridges, seeking the seams in the defense, aiming to collapse the perimeter from the rear. How do you hold a perimeter when the darkness itself seems to be bleeding enemy soldiers? You rely on interlocking fields of fire, and you pray your weapons do not freeze. To understand the sheer butchery of these night engagements, we have to look closely at the small arms dictating the close-quarters combat. The American infantryman was heavily reliant on the M1 carbine, a lightweight, semi-automatic weapon chambered in the .30 carbine cartridge. In the jungles of the Pacific during World War II, it was a highly effective tool. But the frozen mountains of North Korea revealed a fatal ballistic flaw. The .30 carbine round is essentially a hot pistol cartridge, lacking the heavy mass and high velocity of a true rifle round, like the .30-06 fired by the M1 Garand. As Chinese infantry charged up the slopes, they were wearing thick, quilted cotton winter coats, layered over whatever civilian clothing they possessed. These coats were soaked in frozen sweat and caked with ice. American Marines quickly discovered that at ranges beyond 50 yards, the .30 carbine round simply lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate those frozen layers of clothing. Marines reported shooting, charging Chinese soldiers 3 or 4 times center mass, only to see them keep coming. In a desperate night defense, stopping power is everything, and the carbine was failing the test. Conversely, the Chinese shock troops were armed with the Soviet-designed PPSH-41, widely known as the burp gun. This weapon was a stamped steel masterpiece of brutal efficiency, firing the high-velocity 7.6 2x25mm Tokarev pistol round. Fed by a massive 71-round drum magazine, it fired at a staggering cyclic rate of 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. It was inaccurate at range, but the Chinese did not fight at range. They used the darkness to close within grenade-throwing distance. When a Chinese assault team breached a Marine foxhole line, the burp gun was devastating. It functioned flawlessly in the extreme cold because its loose tolerances and heavy bolt simply smashed through any ice or for frozen lubrication. The grenade dynamic was equally terrifying. The Chinese relied heavily on the Type 67 stick grenade, a design copied from the classic German potato masher. It was a concussive weapon, relying on blast pressure rather than fragmentation, and its wooden handle allowed a soldier to leverage it for greater throwing distance. The Americans were throwing the Mk2 defensive hand grenade, the pineapple grenade. It was a fragmentation weapon, designed to shatter its cast iron body into lethal shrapnel. But the extreme cold wreaked havoc on the American munitions. The chemical delay fuses in the Mk2 grenades would often fail to ignite, or they would burn erratically, resulting in dud grenades or worse, premature detonations. Marines had to pull the pin, release the spoon, and hold the live grenade for a terrifying 2 seconds just to ensure the fuse was burning before hurling it into the darkness. The artillery of this mountain war was not the massive howitzers, but the infantry mortar. The Chinese possessed virtually no heavy artillery, but they were masters of the 60mm and 82mm mortar. Because they had pre-registered their targets during the day, observing the American positions from the high peaks, their night barrages were frighteningly accurate. The American response relied on their own 60mm, 81mm, and the massive 4.2-inch heavy mortars. But digging in was a logistical nightmare. The ground at the Chosin Reservoir was frozen to a depth of 14 inches. It was like solid concrete. Standard entrenching tools simply bounced off, snapping their wooden handles. To dig a foxhole, Marines had to use blocks of C4 plastic explosive to blow craters in the ice, and then hack away the shattered earth. As the battle raged at Udom, the survival of the entire 1st Marine Division hinged on a single isolated piece of terrain known as Tokhtong Pass. Look at the tactical map of the reservoir. Udom is at the western edge, and the division's main supply base at Hagaru-ri is 14 miles to the south. Connecting them is a single winding dirt road that climbs through a narrow gorge. Dominating that gorge is Fox Hill, a steep rocky prominence at Tokhtong Pass. If the Chinese took Fox Hill, the road would be permanently severed. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments at Udom would be entirely cut off, facing total annihilation. We can look back at the Battle of the Little Big Horn in 1876 to understand the stakes. General George Custer's 7th Cavalry was surrounded and wiped out because they lost mobility, lost the high ground, and were overwhelmed by superior numbers in broken terrain. General O.P. Smith was determined not to let his Marines suffer a modern-day Little Bighorn. He ordered Captain William Barber and the 246 men of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines to hold Tokhtong Pass at all costs. On the night of November 27th, Fox Company was hit by an entire Chinese regiment, roughly 3,000 men. The assault came in endless human waves, illuminated by the ghostly green light of descending parachute flares. The Marines on Fox Hill were fighting hand-to-hand, using entrenching tools, bayonets, and bare fists when their weapons jammed. Captain Barber was shot through the pelvis, but he refused medical evacuation, commanding his men from a stretcher in the freezing snow. For 5 days and 5 nights, Fox Company held the hill. They were supplied by perilous daytime airdrops, with cargo planes kicking out pallets of ammunition and medical supplies. But the reality of combat medicine at -30 degrees is a nightmare that defies comprehension. What happens to the human body when a piece of jagged shrapnel tears through it at 30 degrees below zero? Blood instantly freezes. Shock sets in within minutes. The medics, known as Navy corpsmen, faced an impossible task. The morphine syrettes, designed to kill the agonizing pain of traumatic amputations, froze solid in their medical kits. Corpsmen had to carry the syrettes in their mouths against their own cheeks, using their body heat to keep the liquid narcotic from turning to ice. Blood plasma dropped by parachute was frozen solid in its glass bottles. Medics tried to thaw it over the exhaust pipes of running jeeps, often shattering the glass in the process. The wounded were stacked in shallow trenches, covered with parachutes, slowly freezing to death while waiting for a medevac that could not come. While the Marines were fighting for their lives on the western reservoir, a completely different tragedy was unfolding on the eastern shore. Here, General Almond had deployed elements of the United States Army's 7th Infantry Division, forming a unit known as Task Force McLean, later renamed Task Force Faith. Commanded by Colonel Alan McLean, and later by Lieutenant Colonel Don Carlos Faith, this task force of roughly 3,000 soldiers was dangerously exposed. Unlike the Marines, who had deliberately consolidated their perimeters, the Army units were strung out along the eastern road in 3 separate, isolated encampments. They were poorly supplied, lacking winter gear, and critically, their radio communications were failing due to the extreme cold and the mountainous terrain. When the Chinese 80th Division struck Task Force Faith, it was a slaughter. The Chinese infiltrated the gaps between the Army perimeters, cutting them off from each other and from the main base at Hagaru-ri. The Army possessed immense firepower, specifically the M16 half-track armed with a quad mount of 50 caliber machine guns and the M19 gun motor carriage, a light tank chassis mounting dual 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. When these weapons were turned horizontally against massed infantry, the results were apocalyptic. The 40mm high-explosive shells would literally vaporize a human body upon impact. But heavy weapons require heavy logistics. The task force was cut off. They ran out of gasoline, turning their tracked vehicles into static bunkers. Then they ran out of ammunition. The situation of Task Force Faith draws a direct historical parallel to the famous Lost Battalion of the United States 77th Division during the Meuse-Argonne offensive of World War I. In 1918, Major Charles Whittlesey's men were surrounded in a dark, unforgiving forest, cut off from all supply lines, enduring relentless enemy fire and friendly artillery barrages. But in the Argonne forest, the men were not fighting the weather as much as the Germans. At Chosin, the weather was inflicting as many casualties as the Chinese bullets. Colonel Maclean was killed early in the battle, mistakenly walking toward a group of Chinese soldiers he believed were friendly reinforcements. Lieutenant Colonel Faith took command, attempting to organize a desperate breakout to the south. But the command and control structure had completely disintegrated. The convoy of wounded, loaded onto 2.5-ton trucks, was repeatedly ambushed from the high ground. Chinese soldiers dropped grenades into the open beds of the trucks, massacring the helpless casualties. Don Faith was mortally wounded by a fragmentation grenade, and the task force dissolved into small, terrified pockets of men trying to survive the frozen trek across the ice of the reservoir itself. Out of 3,000 soldiers in Task Force Faith, only about 1,000 managed to reach the Marine lines at Hagaru-ri, and almost all of them were severely wounded or suffering from catastrophic frostbite. The task force had been completely wiped off the order of battle. Down at Hagaru-ri, at the southern tip of the reservoir, General O. Smith was staring at a strategic catastrophe. His division was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The Chinese had surrounded Udam-ni, annihilated the forces east of the reservoir, and were now massing on the ridges above Hagaru-ri itself. The perimeter at Hagaru-ri was incredibly fragile, manned by headquarters clerks, cooks, vehicle mechanics, and combat engineers. These rear echelon troops were suddenly thrust into brutal frontline combat, holding the line with heavy machine guns and sheer desperation. But Smith had one trump card left. That dirt airstrip he had ordered built weeks earlier was finally operational. It was barely long enough for a C-47 Skytrain to land, and it was under constant enemy mortar fire, but it was a lifeline. Over the next few days, cargo planes executed a miraculous air bridge, flying in thousands of rounds of artillery ammunition and flying out over 4,000 critically wounded men. The arithmetic of the battlefield was brutally clear. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1. The temperature was holding steady at -25 degrees. The single dirt road leading south to the sea, their only avenue of escape, was cut in dozens of places, heavily defended by Chinese roadblocks, blown bridges, and fortified ridges. General Almond flew into Hagaru-ri, panicked by the collapse of his command, and suggested that Smith abandon his heavy equipment, burn his vehicles, and order his men to exfiltrate through the mountains on foot. It was an order of sheer desperation, a recipe for a frozen death march that would have resulted in the complete destruction of the division. Smith flatly refused. He would not leave his dead, he would not leave his wounded, and he would not leave his artillery. He was going to bring his division out as a cohesive fighting force, smashing through the Chinese lines with every ounce of mechanized firepower he had left. The stage was set for the most harrowing fighting withdrawal in American military history, a bloody, grinding march down a frozen gauntlet where survival would depend on close air support, armored bulldozers, and the absolute refusal to surrender. General Oliver P. Smith did not view the impending movement as a retreat. When questioned by war correspondents, he famously clarified that they were not retreating, they were simply attacking in a different direction. This was not bravado, it was a precise tactical reality. The 1st Marine Division was completely surrounded, meaning the rear of their column was engaged in just as much heavy combat as the vanguard. To break out of the Hagaru-ri perimeter and reach the coastal port of Hungnam, the Marines had to execute a fighting withdrawal, a maneuver widely considered the most difficult operation in the military textbook. The tactical formation was a massive mechanized rectangle moving at a crawl down a single-lane dirt track. The tanks, the artillery, and the trucks carrying the wounded were confined to the road, forming the vulnerable center. To protect this mechanized spine, Marine infantry had to scale the jagged ridges on both sides of the road, fighting a grueling, peak-by-peak battle to clear Chinese ambush positions before the convoy could advance. They were not just fighting the Chinese Ninth Army Group, they were fighting the absolute limits of human endurance. The reliance on mechanized logistics is a double-edged sword. We can look back to the year 9 D and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest to see the historical precedent for this specific type of disaster. In that ancient conflict, 3 heavily armored Roman legions were annihilated by lightly armed Germanic tribes because the Chinese were strung out along a narrow, muddy path in a dense forest, unable to deploy their superior formations. The Chinese strategy at Chosin was as identical to the Germanic tribes. They wanted to trap the heavy, road-bound American column in the narrow mountain gorges and bleed it to death from the high ground. But General Smith understood this historical trap perfectly. Unlike the Romans or even the ill-fated task force Faith on the eastern side of the reservoir, Smith refused to let his men stay tied exclusively to the road. By forcing his frozen, exhausted infantry to seize the commanding heights flanking the supply route, he denied the Chinese the plunging fire they needed to destroy the convoy. The breakout began on December 6th, with the vanguard pushing toward the village of Koto-ri. The advance was measured in yards, not miles. The Chinese had blown every bridge, mined the road, and established interlocking fields of machine gun fire at every choke point. The American response relied entirely on the terrifying synergy of ground-to-air communication. Marine forward air controllers embedded with the infantry and carrying heavy backpack radios directed F-4U Corsairs and F-9F Panther jets with devastating precision. Because the Chinese tactics dictated closing within 50 yards of the American lines to negate artillery fire, the aircraft were dropping napalm and 500-pound bombs practically on top of friendly positions. The psychological toll on the Chinese troops was catastrophic. They were freezing, starving, and being incinerated by an enemy they could not touch. General Song Shilun's Ninth Army Group was slowly being ground into dust, but they continued to throw human waves at the American column, driven by iron discipline and the threat of execution by their political commissars. How do you move a mechanized division through a mountain pass when the only road has been blown into a bottomless gorge? This was the ultimate logistical nightmare facing the Marines as they approached the Funchilin Pass, south of Koto-ri. The road here hugged the side of a sheer cliff, and the Chinese had blown a 29-foot gap in the single-lane bridge over a hydroelectric penstock. There was no bypass. There was a steep mountain wall on one side and a 1,500-foot drop into a rocky abyss on the other. Without a bridge, the tanks, the artillery, and the thousands of wounded men in the trucks would have to be abandoned. The solution devised by American engineers and aviators remains one of the most audacious logistical feats in military history. They decided to drop a bridge from the sky. The Air Force utilized C-199 flying boxcars, heavy transport aircraft operating out of Japan. The payload was the M2 Treadway Bridge. These were prefabricated steel sections, each weighing 2,500 pounds. Dropping a solid block of steel weighing over a ton into a narrow mountain gorge required experimental rigging. The parachute riggers attached 2 massive G-11 cargo parachutes to each bridge section. On December 7th, 8 C-119s flew low over the drop zone at Koto-ri. They kicked the massive steel sections out the back of the aircraft. 6 of the sections landed intact. Marine combat engineers, operating under constant enemy sniper fire in -20-degree weather, used 2 armored bulldozers to maneuver the steel treads into place over the abyss. They built a wooden frame over the blown concrete abutments and laid the steel tracks down. It was a terrifyingly narrow crossing. The treads of the M4A3E8 Sherman tanks hung over the edges of the steel by inches. One slip of the steering levers meant a fatal plunge into the gorge. But the bridge held. The mechanized column rolled across, leaving the Chinese commanders completely stunned. They had calculated that the blown bridge was the final, inescapable trap, completely underestimating the industrial might and aerial logistics of the United States military. This brings us to the profound intelligence and strategic failures that created the Chosin disaster in the first place. The American reliance on signals intelligence, or SIGINT, and high-altitude aerial reconnaissance created a fatal blind spot. The intelligence apparatus in Tokyo and Washington was looking for radio traffic and massive mechanized supply columns, the signatures of a conventional Western-style army. Because the Chinese People's Volunteer Army maintained strict radio silence, communicating via runners and bugles, and because they moved exclusively at night while hiding in caves during the day, the American intelligence community concluded they did not exist. It was a classic case of mirror imaging, assuming the enemy will fight exactly the way you do. The strategic lesson here is written in blood. Technology cannot replace human intelligence, and absolute air supremacy is utterly useless if you cannot find the target. As the 1st Marine Division finally broke out of the mountains and reached the coastal plain of Hungnam, the operation shifted from a fighting withdrawal to a massive amphibious evacuation. We often compare this to the British evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940. At Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force was saved by a miracle of civilian logistics, but they left all their heavy weapons, tanks, and artillery on the beaches of France, returning home as a shattered army. The evacuation of Hungnam was a completely different beast. The United States Navy assembled an armada of 193 ships. Under the protective umbrella of naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers, the military did not just evacuate the men. They loaded out 105,000 troops, 17,500 heavy vehicles, and 350,000 tons of supplies. Furthermore, in a massive humanitarian effort, they evacuated 91,000 North Korean civilian refugees who were fleeing the communist advance. When the last ship pulled away from the docks on Christmas Eve of 1950, Navy demolition teams detonated hundreds of tons of explosives, completely obliterating the port facilities to deny them to the advancing Chinese. The 1st Marine Division came out of the frozen hell of Chosin as a fully cohesive, heavily armed fighting force, ready to be redeployed. The political and economic shockwaves of the Chosin Reservoir altered the course of the 20th century. When the news of the massive Chinese intervention reached Washington, President Harry S. Truman declared a national emergency. General MacArthur, furious at the humiliation of his forces, demanded the authorization to drop atomic bombs on Chinese industrial centers in Manchuria and requested the deployment of nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan. Truman, recognizing that this would ignite World War III and potentially draw the Soviet Union into a global nuclear exchange, refused. This fundamental clash over civilian versus military control of the armed forces eventually led to Truman firing MacArthur, a highly controversial move that reasserted the constitutional authority of the presidency. Economically, the shock of Chosin triggered the implementation of NSC 68, a classified policy paper that resulted in the massive permanent militarization of the United States. The defense budget quadrupled almost overnight. The military-industrial complex as we know it today, with its permanent standing armies and massive defense contracts, was forged in the freezing fires of the Chosin Reservoir. We must also analyze the battle through the lens of attrition. The United States forces suffered roughly 18,000 casualties, including thousands of severe frostbite cases. It was a heavy, bloody toll. But the Chinese 9th Army Group was practically erased from the map. General Song Shilan's forces suffered an estimated 50 to 60,000 casualties. Entire Chinese divisions were frozen solid in the mountains, their combat effectiveness completely destroyed by a combination of American firepower and the merciless Manchurian winter. The Chinese achieved their strategic objective of pushing the United Nations forces out of North Korea. But the tactical cost was so catastrophic that the 9th Army Group had to be withdrawn from the war for months to rebuild. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir proved that a technologically superior, mechanized force could survive envelopment by a vastly numerically superior light infantry force, provided they maintained unit cohesion, secured the high ground, and possessed the logistical capacity to supply themselves from the air. War is not just a clash of steel. It is a test of human endurance against the absolute limits of nature and logistics. What do you believe was the single most critical factor that allowed the 1st Marine Division to escape total destruction at the Chosin Reservoir? A. The relentless close air support from Marine aviators. B. The brilliant tactical foresight and leadership of General O. P. Smith. Or C. The massive logistical advantage and the miraculous airdrop of the Treadway Bridge. Let us know your choice in the comments below, and keep your powder dry.